April 19th, 1945. New Mexico desert. The bus lurched to a halt and fine red dust rose like smoke through the shattered silence. Inside, 37 Japanese women sat rigid, hands clenched, eyes forward, waiting for the violence they'd been promised. The door swung open. Sunlight poured in, blinding and absolute. Then they saw him, a man in a Stetson hat, spurs catching the light, leaning against a wooden post like he was waiting for Sunday service. He nodded once, slow and easy, and said in a drawl thick as molasses, "Welcome, ladies." One woman's breath caught. Another's hands began to tremble. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't war. This was something they had no name for, and it would break them wider than any bomb ever could. Before we continue, if this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. History like this deserves to be shared, so subscribe, and let's keep these untold stories alive together. Now, let's go back to that desert, where everything these women believed about honor, duty, and survival was about to collapse under the weight of a kindness they never expected. They had prepared for death, not decency. For months, as the war closed in like a tightening fist, the women had been drilled in one absolute truth. Capture meant dishonor worse than death. They were auxiliary nurses, radio operators, field medics trained, uniformed, expendable. During orientation, they had memorized the code word by word, better to die than to be taken. They rehearsed it in whispers behind barracks, practiced the mechanics of ending their own lives with hairpins, belts, vials of morphine smuggled in coat linings. One instructor had told them plainly, "If you are captured, you die. Not perhaps, you die." The shame wouldn't just fall on them. It would erase their families, their names, their ancestors from history itself. The rumors had been specific and horrifying. American soldiers would strip them naked, parade them through streets, use them for experiments, send them home pregnant as proof of betrayal. Officers whispered that the enemy collected Japanese women like trophies, that cruelty was sport for them. So when the surrender order came, some women tried to run. One climbed a tree and threw herself off, legs shattering on impact. Another swallowed morphine, only to vomit it back up in the dirt, sobbing and humiliated. The nurse, 23 years old, hollow-eyed from malnutrition, had simply frozen, her body caught between the instinct to flee and the weight of exhaustion. She closed her eyes and waited for the rifle, but to her stomach, it never came. Instead, a voice said gently, "You're all right, miss." A canteen was placed in her hand. She didn't understand the English words, but she understood the tone. It was calm, almost tender. And in that moment, the first crack appeared in everything she'd been taught. The camp they arrived at looked nothing like a prison. Low wooden buildings stood in neat rows, their planked sides sun-bleached and weathered. Barbed wire circled the perimeter, yes, but it wasn't jagged or cruel, just methodical, functional. Beyond the fences, mesas rose against the sky like ancient monuments, their flat tops scorched rust-red by the relentless sun. Horses stood tethered in patches of shade, tails flicking lazily. Saddles hung from railings. Somewhere in the distance a harmonica played, its notes soft and incongruous against the silence of their fear. The guards didn't bark orders. They nodded. One tipped his hat, actually tipped it, like greeting a neighbor at a general store. Another handed out canteens of water with both hands, palms open, a gesture so startlingly respectful it felt like mockery. But it wasn't mockery. It was just how they'd been raised. The mess hall that first evening smelled like roasted meat and something sweet honey, maybe molasses. The women shuffled in slowly, eyes darting, hands still clenched. Trays were handed to them without comment. On each tray, a bowl of chili, thick with beef and beans, a square of golden cornbread still warm, a slice of apple, and a tall glass of iced tea, clinking with ice. One woman stared at her tray as though it might vanish if she blinked. Another whispered in disbelief, "This is for us?" A guard nearby nodded and said, "Sure is." Dig in. The phrase was foreign and rough-sounding, but somehow friendly. No one moved. The nurse lifted her spoon with trembling hands and tasted the chili. It was hot, rich, shockingly flavorful. Her stomach long accustomed to saltwater broth, and weevil-infested rice recoiled, then adjusted. Her eyes welled up, not from pain, but from memory. Her mother stirring fishbone soup in a dented pot. Her brother licking crumbs off his palm after someone dropped bread in the street. And here she was in enemy hands, eating beef slow-cooked in tomatoes. It made no sense. None of it did. That night, lying on a real mattress with a wool blanket pulled up to her chin, the nurse wrote in a small notebook she'd been given. Just a few lines. The enemy makes jokes about biscuits. They do not speak of death. She stared at the words for a long time, then added, "I do not know what war this is." Around her, other women lay awake, unable to sleep beneath the weight of something far more dangerous than cruelty, comfort, because kindness, they were learning, could break you just as thoroughly as hate, and it was harder to defend against. The work, when offered, was voluntary. That word alone felt like a trap. Voluntary, not ordered, not demanded, offered. Some women swept paths or washed uniforms. Others helped in the kitchens, learning to knead dough and mix cornmeal batter. A few were assigned to garden plots, small rectangles of earth bordered by stone. The nurse was handed a trowel and a paper envelope of seeds by a guard who gestured toward a patch of dry soil and said simply, "Grow something." She stood there, stunned. No one had ever told her to grow anything. She had learned to sterilize scalpels, bind wounds, close the eyes of the dead. But coaxing life from soil, that was foreign. She knelt slowly, pressing her fingers into the warm dirt. The seeds were pale and dry like nothing at all, but she placed them carefully, one by one, covering them gently. When she stood, her knees ached, but something inside her had shifted. Not peace, not forgiveness, but purpose. And came the moment that changed everything. It was mid-afternoon, the sun merciless and flat against the earth. The work detail had been light, mostly weeding and hauling water, but the heat was brutal. The nurse felt the world tilt before she understood what was happening, a tightening behind her eyes, a roar in her ears. She told herself to stay standing. Weakness invited punishment. That lesson was older than memory. She bent toward the soil again, gripping the trowel too hard, her breath shallow and fast. Then the ground rushed up. She didn't fall so much as slide sideways, her body folding in on itself. Boots thudded across the dirt. Before her face hit the earth, strong arms caught her, lifting her clear off her feet. The cowboy ignored protocol entirely. He hoisted her like she weighed nothing, one arm beneath her knees, the other across her back. He muttered something sharp under his breath, not at her, but at the sun, at the situation. He carried her to a wagon parked beneath slatted shade, and laid her down carefully, easing her head against a folded jacket. "Easy now," he said, voice low, almost embarrassed. He tipped his canteen to her lips. "Drink." The water was warm and metallic, but it was water. She swallowed reflexively, coughing weakly. Around them the other women stood frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. A second guard approached, his expression tight. "You know you're not supposed to," the guard began. "I know," the cowboy said. His voice wasn't defiant, just final. He stayed with her until her breathing slowed, until faint color returned to her cheeks. Then he straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers, and stepped back. When an officer arrived moments later, red-faced and clipped, the reprimand was swift and quiet. There was pointing, head-shaking. The cowboy listened, nodding once, twice. He didn't argue. When it was over, he walked past the wagon, past the nurse, past the watching women. At the edge of the garden, he stopped. He turned, and without a word, he tipped his hat. Then he walked away. The moment spread through the camp faster than fear ever had. By nightfall, it had been retold a dozen times, each version softer, sharper, heavier, with meaning. Some said he'd been docked pay. Others claimed he'd volunteered for extra duty. No one knew for sure. What mattered was the choice. He had broken protocol, not for information, not for praise, but because someone was in trouble. From that day on, the women watched the guards differently, not with fear, but with quiet attention. They noticed the small things, men standing between them and the sun, offering water without comment, tipping hats, holding doors, keeping hands to themselves. It was an unwritten code older than the war, a form of honor they felt instinctively. Not the honor they'd been taught, one that demanded death or glorified suffering, but another kind. This one asked only, protect the vulnerable, keep your word, do right when unseen. Bushido taught honor through sacrifice of the self. The cowboy code taught honor through responsibility to others. The contrast cut deep. One morning, an announcement came through an interpreter. They could write home. Rules applied, but the truth was allowed. Some refused, suspecting a trap. Others hesitated. A few wrote. They gave me food. They gave me medicine. My feet no longer bleed. These letters weren't betrayals. They were rebellions against silence. A nurse wrote her mother again, describing the man who lifted her into a wagon. She ended simply, he was more honorable than many of our own. These words were whispers in a sealed room, but they spread. Back in Japan, censors read the incoming mail first, blacking out lines, redacting pages, but not all. Too much had slipped through. Mothers talked to neighbors. Sisters passed scraps to old school friends. Whispers turned to murmurs. My daughter is in a camp. She was given bread. She has not been touched. By the time the war ended, those whispers had become undeniable. The lie had cracked. Back in the camp, the women still lived behind barbed wire. But now they knew the wire wasn't what separated them from the world. The real wall had been built in their minds, and it was starting to crumble. Writing became ritual, a way to reclaim their voices, their identities, their own internal maps of morality. It no longer mattered if the letters reached their destination. What mattered was that they had written them, because once a lie is named, it cannot hold the same power. And once a prisoner speaks the truth, even in pencil on cheap paper, she is no longer only a prisoner. She is something more. For one woman, the realization was unbearable. Just before dawn, when the camp was quiet enough for grief to echo, Iko, a radio operator who had survived 3 evacuations and a retreat that erased half her unit, sat on her bunk with a letter from home. Her mother's handwriting was thinner now. The message was restrained but clear. Her cousin had died. There was no rice. The furniture burned for heat. Iko read it until the words felt carved into her bones. She went to the washroom, turned on the tap, and pulled a thin cord from her pocket. She looped it around her wrists. She did not cry. Shame had burned that out long ago. The nurse noticed the water running. She pushed the door open and lunged forward, grabbing Iko's wrists. "Stop," she whispered, as if the moment might shatter. Iko resisted weakly. "They died." "I didn't. This is wrong." The nurse held tighter. "If they value us," she said, voice breaking, "why don't we?" Iko collapsed. The cord slipped free. Later, guards were told only that a woman fainted. No report was filed. A chaplain listened for hours. Other women brought tea, sat in silence. Kindness, they realized, had a cost. Fed and clothed, allowed dignity, they were left with dangerous questions. Who am I if I survive? What is loyalty when the enemy shows mercy? Some clung to resentment. Others began to change, seeing dignity not as weakness, but resistance to eat, to rest, to live when death had been demanded. They were acts of defiance against a system that had told them their lives were disposable. One evening the nurse stood by the garden and watched the first green shoots break through the soil. She thought of the words spoken in the washroom, "If they value us, why don't we?" The sentence frightened her, and yet it felt truer than anything she'd been taught. The war ended without ceremony. The announcement came clipped and formal, translated into careful Japanese. The emperor had spoken. Japan had surrendered. The women stood in place, absorbing the words as if they belonged to someone else's life. Some felt relief. Others felt nothing at all. A few felt something dangerously close to grief. Repatriation followed weeks later, trains, ships, paperwork stamped and restamped. The women were given time to pack what little they were allowed to keep. Some chose letters, others folded blankets with reverence. One woman carried nothing but a pair of boots tied together with string. The nurse wrapped her wool blanket tightly, the fabric softened by months of use. In her bag, tucked beneath spare clothes, was a can of peaches she had been issued on the transport ship and could not bring herself to open. The journey back across the ocean was quieter than the one that had brought them west. The women did not huddle in fear. They sat apart, staring at the water, replaying moments no one back home would ever fully understand. Cowboy hats tipping, hands offering canteens, a voice saying, "Easy now." Japan greeted them with silence. The ports were broken cranes twisted, warehouses hollowed by fire. Cities that had once pulsed with life now lay flattened, streets filled with ash and paper and ghosts. Mothers wept openly at the docks, clutching daughters who looked unfamiliar, heavier in body, thinner in spirit. Children stared at the returnees with wide eyes, unsure whether to approach. No bands played. No banners flew. The nurse found her home reduced to a single standing wall. Her mother lived in a neighbor's cellar, thinner than she remembered, her hands rough and cracked. They embraced without words. There was too much to say and no way to say it. That night they ate boiled roots in silence. The nurse lay on a straw mat, the memory of a mattress haunting her back. In the days that followed, the women learned the hardest lesson of all. Survival had set them apart. Neighbors looked at them with curiosity, suspicion, sometimes resentment. "You were fed," one whispered. "You were spared." There were no accusations spoken aloud, but they hung in the air like smoke. To speak of the camps felt obscene. To speak of kindness felt like betrayal, and yet the objects they carried spoke for them. The nurse unpacked her bag slowly. First, a blanket. She laid it over her mother's shoulders when the evening cold crept in. Her mother closed her eyes and said nothing. Then the boots. She offered them to her younger brother, barefoot on the packed dirt floor. He slipped them on carefully. They fit. He stared down for a long moment, jaw tight, then nodded once. He did not ask where they came from. Finally, the can of Peaches Bright, foreign. Her brother hesitated before touching it, as if it might burn. "Did they give this to you?" he asked quietly. She nodded. The peaches were opened that night, divided carefully. Each slice tasted like another world. The women who returned from the West did not speak of heroism or shame. They spoke of gardens, letters, men who tipped their hats, or they spoke of nothing at all. They had left as obedient instruments of war. They returned as witnesses. They had seen a different code, learned that dignity could exist even in captivity. That lesson could not be unlearned. The war ended, but the quiet revolution inside them had only begun. Years passed. Streets were rebuilt. Hunger loosened its grip. Silence became safer than speech. The women married, worked, raised children who never knew sirens or ration lines. Yet beneath ordinary life endured a private reckoning, shaped not by violence, but by mercy. The nurse was old when she visited the museum. It was a modest exhibit, grainy photographs of camps, uniforms, ships. She moved slowly, drawn not to headlines, but to faces. Then she saw him, a small photograph of a man beside a wooden fence, spurs on his boots, a Stetson pulled low, sleeves rolled up, smiling not for the camera. His hands were empty. Her breath caught. In the glass she saw herself reflected, silver-haired, lined, standing, where a frightened young nurse had once stood beneath a desert sun. Her daughter joined her. "Did you know him?" she asked. The nurse nodded. "He saved me," she said, "and he never touched his gun." That was how the revolution endured, not in monuments, but in sentences like that. Kindness did not erase the war or resurrect the dead, but it fractured something powerful, the certainty that enemies must be monsters. The women carried that fracture home. Some taught, some stayed silent, but the seed endured. Long after the guns fell silent, a quieter truth remained. What broke them was not cruelty, but kindness, and that realization became an act of lasting defiance.